Hello, my name is Julie, and it's time to talk about the 14 books I read in November. November was a weird month for a lot of us. I definitely did not feel like reading for a lot of this month, but I actually ended up reading more than average. I think I was just trying to play catch up with myself and ended up going further than I thought. But it is fully wintertime and I wasn't able to film this weekend, so we're dealing with the artificial light, and this is also the second time I've had to film this video, so let's make it quick. Before I talk about the books that I'm going to be reading this month, I want to remind you, if you have not joined already, that my readathon freezathon has started and you can still join it right now as you're watching this. It is running for all of December 2024. It is a wintry themed team-based competitive readathon. You pick a team based on a genre that you want to read and you read to get points for your team, and teams are battling it out for the most points. It's very fun. I'll leave the announcement up in the cards. Let's talk stats. I read 14 books for a total of 4,861 pages. That is the second most books I've read in this year and the fourth most pages I've read this year. Didn't quite make that 5K mark, which would put us at the top of the year. Had an average of 3.79, which is higher than average for this year, and I have one or maybe even two books that I'm considering for a 5-star. Average page count was 347 per book and 162 per day. I read 7 books from my TBR. I added 2 books to my TBR and got rid of 0. So if my count is right, I'm at -19, which is ridiculous. Star ratings, we had a couple of no ratings because it was nonfiction November, but other than that, we've got a lot of 4s, which is great considering the amount of 3s I've had this year. Going into genres, we had a lot of fantasy and a lot of mystery, thriller, horror, not a huge surprise. Then general fiction, nonfiction, and speculative at the bottom. I read 2 sequels, the rest were standalones. As is the case with most months, I read about 1/3 of my books on audiobook, and I read 1 young adult in a sea of adult books. The first book I read this month was Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio. This is a very highly anticipated novella after If We Were Villains is one of the internet's favorite books, but also one of mine. This is marketing itself as horror. I would kind of put it more in the mystery category with a bit of a horror element. About 5 people who regularly meet up at this long abandoned graveyard so that they can smoke, and there is a freshly dug hole in this place that no one has been for decades or even a century, and they're trying to figure out why that happened. This has been getting pretty poor reviews, but I actually quite like this. This is only 100 pages, and the margins are pretty big, and I actually read this in one sitting. So going in knowing that this is extremely short is really imperative. This book felt like a great horror short film. A lot of the critique that I've seen for this book is that it should have been a full-length novel, and I do agree with that. I think that this could have been improved by being a full-length novel, but as a person who doesn't traditionally like novellas, there's only a couple that I think actually do well with their page count and didn't need more. I enjoyed myself quite a bit. I liked following all of the different perspectives that we go through and trying to figure out why this hole was dug, what it has to do with the campus town they're living in, and what the implications might be. It kind of leaves you knowing that something's going to happen and we don't get to see it. I think it could have gone a little bit farther, but I liked the atmosphere and I liked the mystery. I liked so much of this, and it was just a nice thing to sit down and get through in a sitting. So I am going to be giving this a 4-star. Then I read I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai. This is a literary mystery novel about a woman who, when she was in high school, she went to a boarding school, and a girl who was in the theater program with her was found murdered. A man went away for the crime, but our main character has been convinced her whole life that somebody else did it. She is now a well-known podcaster and has been invited to teach a guest lecture at the school, and she starts subtly pushing her students in the direction of trying to solve this crime. This was put on my radar because this was John Green's best fiction book of last year, and I see why he liked it so much. I think this only has like a 3.6, but I could not put this book down for the life of me. I listened to this on audiobook. I think I finished it in like just over 24 hours, which I was listening to it on 2 speed, but still, like, that's kind of unheard of. I was sucked in by the narration style of this and just wanting to know what really happened. I think the mystery did get to me. And what's so interesting about this does have some subtle commentary on true crime and the things that people do because they're so invested in true crime. Our protagonist is not an angel by any means. She, as the book goes on, goes deeper and deeper into things that aren't necessarily moral to try to get the truth out because she believes that justice has not been done. And she starts doing things saying that the ends will justify the means, but is that really the case? There's a lot of commentary about justice, there's commentary on like cancel culture. I just thought that this did such an interesting take on what ends up being not a very complicated mystery, but I think that this book added a lot of depth to it and kind of bringing in sort of the internet angle into it a little bit, how people on the internet have become so obsessed with things that have not touched their lives. I don't know how long this book is going to stick with me, but I did not want to put it down. I think this has some good things to say, and the writing style of this was awesome. So this is getting another solid 4 from me. Then I read Always Look on the Bright Side of Life by Eric Idle, who is one of the members of Monty Python. My dad showed me Monty Python when I was probably middle school or high school, and I loved it. I haven't seen all of their stuff. I'm more just a big fan of the things that I have seen, and I bought this at a thrift store like at least 3 years ago with the intention of reading it immediately and then giving it to my dad. And it's been at least the 3 years, so I've finally given it to my dad. He can read it. But this is labeled a sorta biography, and it is Eric Idle just detailing his life, how he grew up, his start in comedy, all the different things that he did with Monty Python throughout the years, his friendships with the Pythons and with other people. I don't think I've ever read a proper autobiography before. Like, I've read memoirs, and maybe the title of sorta biography made me think that this is going to be a little bit more memoir. It's autobiography. It is a list of everything Eric Idle has done and every famous person he was friends with. As a person who grew up in the US much later than the Pythons were at their peak fame, like, I don't think I really realized just how famous they were. Like, friends with every single famous British musician at the time famous. Eric Idle got married in Lorne Michaels' apartment, and the people who carried in the cake were David Bowie and Mick Jagger. Like, that's wild. But I don't know that this book gives a whole lot of insight into his life. It certainly gives a timeline for the things that he's done, but I don't know that it really brought much more to it than it needed to. There are some emotional moments, like, for example, the death of Graham Chapman, where he's talking about the loss of his friend. There are a couple moments there that are emotional, but ultimately, like, it's a list. So I don't really normally rate nonfiction, so I'm not going to be rating this one either. But if you're into Monty Python to some degree, I think you could like reading this. If you know nothing about it, this probably isn't for you. And if you know everything about it, this probably isn't for you either. So if you're in that middle ground like me, this could be something you could read to find out more about what Eric Idle has done during his lifetime. Then the next book I read was Summer Suns by Lee Mandelo. I read this for my book club, 3 of Clubs. Every single quarter, we pick a different theme or subgenre and pick 3 books to read. This was our second book. If you would like to join us in December, we are going to be reading Evocation by S.T. Gibson. Back to Summer Suns. This I decided to pick for the club because it's fairly recent, fairly popular Southern Gothic that I wanted to add to the repertoire. This is about Andrew, who has been best friends with Eddie for their entire lives. They are closer than close can be. And Eddie ended up going ahead to grad school before Andrew and kept saying, "Oh, you can come along later, not right now," and kept putting it off, putting it off, putting it off, until Eddie ended up dying, and Andrew is absolutely shattered and doesn't know what to do with it, except he has been offered the position that Eddie had at this college to continue his study of American folklore. And Andrew is trying to figure out, by talking to all the people that Eddie interacted with, what actually happened to him, because the two of them have had some supernatural things happen happened in their past that he thinks might have to do with it. This was one of the books for my 12 Friends 12 Books 12 Months challenge, and I get why somebody put this on my radar. Because on paper, there's a lot of things that I should like. I've heard comparisons to the Raven Boys here, and the plot in the Dream Themes where it's talking about Ronin and doing the car races and everything. It definitely has the same vibes, but I ultimately didn't really enjoy it. There were a lot of things that I thought got in the way. It might have been because I read this at a difficult part of the month. Couple of good things. The writing style of this, like just the vocabulary of the author alone, incredible. Fantastic. Could not get over it. I really like the flavor of the horror here, where there are these things called revenants, which are kind of ghost-like, zombie-like. Think Enchantress from Suicide Squad. Like, that's what I was kind of picturing. And I also really love the themes that this discussed, specifically about toxic masculinity. So many of the characters in this book are extremely toxically masculine, and are kind of trying to figure out how to overcome it over the course of the book. And heteronormativity, where characters aren't wanting to acknowledge their own queer identities because they're so afraid of it. Those things were all great. However, the plot and the characters got in the way for me. For one, Andrew is going through so much grief, and every single character around him is so ridiculously selfish that they cannot let him have a minute by himself. Everybody is so me all the time, and Andrew just kind of gets bullied into putting up with it, and I could not stand for it. Like, I was so mad at all of these characters, and I never forgave basically any of them. And I'd say that I don't need to like a character to like a book, but like, the book forgives people that I wouldn't forgive. Andrew isn't a perfect person either, but I at least definitely was rooting for him. I would also like to say I was under the impression that this was a young adult book, and then I started reading it. It is absolutely not. If I have ever led anyone astray that this is a YA book, that is completely wrong. Then the plot. This deals with academia a little bit, as our character is in grad school, and the thing that might have happened to him was kind of tied into Eddie's research. Every time, like, the advisors or anything were mentioned, it felt so repetitive. It felt like we kept seeing the same scene over and over again of like him meeting with somebody and them getting mad at each other and getting nowhere and being like, oh, you should take up Eddie's research. It just felt like we were just not getting anywhere. It felt like a dream where you keep having to repeat the exact same actions, and like not in a good way. The hard partying scenes didn't really do a lot for me either. And then I felt like I wanted to know so much more or get more depth to the horror element here. I felt like we got like a very simple explanation for it or story for it, and it doesn't feel the need to go any further. Stylistically, there were choices that I liked. Plot-wise, I just really wasn't into this. So I'm giving this a 3-star. I would be interested in reading a different book from this author in the future if I felt like the plot was very different and I was pretty interested in it. But yeah. Then I listened to Good Girl, Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. If you have been following me for a minute, you might know that this is completely unheard of for me to read a sequel so close to having read the first book. I think that was in August that I read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, and it is easily one of my favorite books that I've read this year. I got some of my friends to read it, and they are already onto the sequels. I'm like, I have to catch up. In A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, Pip is a teenager who is doing a school project, and she is trying to solve a murder in her town. And in the second book, one of her friend's older brothers has gone missing, and she is trying to find him before he might turn up dead. She has also posted a podcast of the Andy Bell case from last book online, and she is kind of having to deal with the internet's opinions now being thrown at her because she is becoming a little bit of a public figure. Meanwhile, she's now trying to use this platform as a way to try to help find the missing guy, Jamie. Jamie has wandered away from home a couple times before. His family feels like there's really something wrong this time, and even though Pip is really traumatized by what happened to her in the last book and doesn't want to, she sees that the police aren't going to do anything, so she takes it upon herself to try to solve the case. I really liked the ticking clock aspect of this book, where we know that the longer we go without finding Jamie, the more likely he is not going to be alive by the end of it. Holly Jackson is just really good at constantly giving pieces of information that are going to be important, putting clues in places, giving you a big enough cast of characters that a lot of things could be true, but ultimately you get to the end and everything makes sense and you think, why didn't I think of that before? In the first book, I definitely had taken notes and was trying to predict things. And in this book, I was a little bit more along for the ride and wasn't trying to guess anything. And I was ultimately pretty satisfied with the ending. I think that the first book was a very typical like murder mystery book, and the second book kind of brought in some more complicatedness to some of the things that was happening to our characters, and I like that a bit. I think I was less emotionally invested in this book than I was in the first book, but I still really was into the plot. So this is getting, I think, a 4.25 from me. Then I read The Only One Left by Riley Sager. I only read this for the Buzzword Readathon Challenge for November to read a book with only in the title. This is basically the only book that I had on my radar that I was remotely interested in, that I could get my hands on. So I went with it. It's been a while since I've read a Riley Sager. This is about a woman who is a caretaker who came under fire because a woman who was in her care ended up dying and people were blaming her for it, even though she claims she is innocent of it. And now she's back at her job. She has been assigned a pretty precarious position, and that is to go up to this mansion that's on a cliffside and take care of a woman who, over 50 years ago, supposedly killed her entire family. And now she is bedridden, she can't even talk, and the only thing she can do is type out little messages on a typewriter. And our main character is kind of creeped out by the whole mansion and the people who are in it, and she is trying to figure out from these messages from this woman what really happened on that night so many years ago. This has a really, really derivative gothic setting. I know I just said my book club is reading gothic books. We did reread Rebecca in October, and I have read too many books that are trying to do the Rebecca mansion, and I am kind of tired of it. I just think that the setup of this book, so much of this book felt boring and derivative, and like I should not be invested in it. So when the end of the book came, and suddenly there are so many plot twists on top of one another that just keep going and you think you get to an answer and there's another one, that like I was not properly invested when we got to the end of this. I guessed some of the plot twists. I guessed like the first big one. I didn't think our main character was very interesting at all. She is very much the gothic protagonist who doesn't have a personality of her own and is just a vessel for us to experience the story. I didn't really care for the now timeline. The past timeline I also thought was kind of boring, and it's like not until that last 10% did this book capture my attention. So when it does pay off, I don't necessarily care about the payoff. So I totally get why some people would be super into this book. I think this has a higher rating than a lot of Riley Sager's books. I think the majority of this book was too much of a drag for me to really get invested. So I'm giving this 3.5. Then for my latest video, I read a bunch of the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees for fantasy. If you have not checked that out, I would really appreciate it if you did. I did a video predicting the Goodreads nominations, and then I did this video reading what the nominations were, discussing what I got right and wrong in the nominations, and analyzing what the nominations looked like and comparing them to previous years. It was a lot of fun to get through, and I read a bunch of good stuff. The first book I read, and that was A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This is a dark fantasy horror that is lightly inspired by The Goose Girl, which is a Brothers Grimm story. Our main character, Cordelia, lives in this grim, vaguely Regency feeling setting, and her mother has complete control over her. And not just in the regular way that a mother would have control over her daughter, but in a magical way. Her mother can physically control her entire body at will. Cordelia has no privacy, she has no life of her own, she's very restricted, and she wants nothing more than to be able to be her own person. And when her mother decides that she wants to marry somebody so that she can then get Cordelia married, the two of them end up visiting this man her mother is trying to seduce, and Cordelia is suddenly around people who are treating her like a human being for the first time. And the man's sister starts noticing that there's totally something up with mom and is trying to put a stop to it. This is the first fantasy that I have read from T. Kingfisher. I have only read horror titles from her before, and I loved the blend of fantasy and horror that I've read in her books, and this taking a little bit more of the fantasy, I did like that quite a bit. The blend of horror and fantasy, especially when it comes to the fairy tale area, is such a fun sandbox to play in, and I really enjoyed how this was what I called an interpolation of the story of the Goose Girl. T. Kingfisher kind of just takes bits and pieces of the myth and does whatever she wants with them, and it was really interesting to see those play out in a way that was not restricted by the original story. I really rooted for our main characters to defeat this sorceress. I think that this had a very light amount of magic to it that would make it approachable to a lot of readers. I thought that the metaphor here of an abusive relationship with a parent was so well done, because it is literally on the page, but also the element of the magic kind of brings even more to that theme. So I ended up giving this a 4.25 and thought this was a very solid nominee. Then I read A Song to Drown Rivers by Anne Long. This is the story of Sisha, who is one of the four beauties of China, these four legendary figures, three of them being real people and one of them being fictional, Sisha being one of the real people. So she lived like 2,000 years ago and was a peasant girl who was so beautiful that her kingdom decided to make her be a concubine to a rival king that they were having wars with to try to fell their empire. Meanwhile, Sisha is falling in love with the man who sort of signed her up for this and is trying to walk the line of having the king fall in love with her while also being the spy sort of character. Here's the thing, this was nominated for the Fantasy Award. I do not believe that this is a fantasy book. This is the third book that I have read this year that calls itself a fantasy book but is set on Earth and has no magic, or even negligible magic if you want to do that. I think this book has a very small speculative element that does not come until the very end of the book, so much so that I believe that this is a historical fiction and not a fantasy. I think it's just being marketed as a fantasy because it deals with like court politics, but that's not what fantasy means. I enjoyed my time with this book. I did not actually read the story of Sisha until I was a good amount of the way through the book, so I was being introduced to the story through this book, and I was getting along with it. I liked our main character. There didn't feel like there was a lot going on. I was just, happy along for the ride. When I did end up reading the story, I realized that this book doesn't really add anything to the story. This book does not break from even just the Wikipedia article of Sisha. And obviously, I am no expert in the story, but I felt like this book could have done so much more to bring life and depth into the story, because what Sisha must have gone through would have been so awful and traumatic. She is living as the concubine of this brutal king who believes violence is the answer. He's supposed to be killing people left, right, and center, and we do see him participate in violence. This book kind of sanitizes that to some degree. The physical violence is there, but when it comes to the fact that our main character is a concubine, the book completely disregards any possible consequences of the title concubine. The emperor literally sleeps next to his concubines like Lucy and Ricky. That took me out of the story so much. I was like, why aren't we addressing this? And because it really avoids this adult conversation and almost PG-ifies the book, I'm wondering if this should be young adult. So this is marketed as a adult fantasy book, and I think it's a young adult historical fiction. I don't know, categories are fake. I'm complaining about this book. I had a good time, and I enjoyed my time reading it. I liked learning the story. And I thought that it also had themes about like people who are participating in war and violence never being good. So I do not think this book is bad. I just think this book missed so much opportunity. I am going to be giving it a 3.5. Then I read A Sweet Sting of Salt by Rose Sutherland. This was another nominee, and this is a retelling of The Selkie Wife. It is sapphic and it is set in early 1800s Nova Scotia. Our main character is Jean and she is a midwife. She is very lonely, especially since her best friend, who she wanted to be around her whole life, was sent away because the two of them were too close. One very stormy night, she hears a woman screaming in pain outside of her window, and she finds her neighbor's fairly new wife extremely pregnant and about to give birth. They give birth to the baby, and afterwards, she's pretty concerned for this woman. She doesn't really speak English. She seems to be talking about the water a lot. She seems skittish. So Jean decides to have a closer eye on her, and the more she looks, the more that Jean does not trust this woman, Murin's husband, Tobias. Of course, we as the reader, if we know anything about the Selkie Wife, we know more than Jean does. I really adored this book. I loved the atmosphere. We're in this old-timey beach town, set in the 1800s, so like it's winter and it's Canada, and these people are out in nearly the wilderness on their own, so like you can feel what the danger of winter is to these people. The feeling of this cold, beachy town was just a strong image for me. And I love Jean as our protagonist so much. She is struggling with wanting to help this woman who is clearly not being treated well, and wanting to help her, but knowing that she is not going to be trusted because the entire community thinks so poorly of her because they think/know that she is lesbian. And she wants to help Murin so much, but she knows if she is the one who takes steps to do it, that could be putting things in more jeopardy, that people are going to doubt things. She doesn't know how much of it is real and how much of it is because she's starting to feel things from Murin. And I just really adored how these women are together. The longing here is so good. I just think that this checked every box that I wanted it to check. The feelings that I was having toward it definitely exceeded expectations. So I'm giving this at least a 4.5, maybe even a 5. I don't know. I definitely do need to think about that. You all know I like to think about my 5 stars. Then the last book I read for that video was Voyage of the Damned by Frances White. This is a debut. This was also a debut. This is marketing itself as a fantasy Agatha Christie murder mystery, and it definitely has an "and then there were none" type vibe. We are set in this fantasy world where there are 12 different provinces and one that has been exiled. Each of them has a ruling family, and one person in that family is the Blessed, and they have a magical power that they keep secret. That once they have children, one of those children will eventually get this power given to them. And our main character, his father, is blessed, and our main character has not gotten a power. And his whole family has just lied and said that he has the power so they can keep up appearances. And now the final person in their generation has gotten their power, and the 12 of them are going to be on a boat together to do this religious ceremony. So they're trapped together for 12 days on this boat, and on the first night, the heir to the Dragon Province, which is the lead province, gets killed. And so our main character, who is extremely looked down upon because he's of the lowest province, who wants everybody to hate him so he can get kicked out of doing his job, and who's very irreverent in his humor, trying to piss people off, has his back against the wall and is trying to solve this mystery with so many people being opposing to him. I think that this was a lot of fun. It's a little bit more on the comedic side than a lot of fantasy that I read. It's not light all of the time. There is still, murders that are going on, and as the book goes further, there are deeper themes that we're discussing, classism, or like what's up with that exiled province, and serious discussions about how our main characters are feeling. But overall, it feels like a pretty light fantasy. The fantasy setup is a little bit like Tumblr-y. It feels a little bit YA, even though this is definitely an adult book. It's just that the world feels like in that style. And this is the third book that I have read this year that is a sci-fi fantasy mystery, and this is the first one that I've read that I felt like was really successful in making a compelling mystery that was the standout element of the book rather than the fantasy, while also maintaining enough logic and putting enough clues in that you don't feel blindsided by any magical twists. That's kind of the problem with a fantasy mystery, is that it breaks the logic of what a murder mystery should be, and I felt like this did a good job of giving you enough pieces along the way. I think that there's a lot of great representation here, a lot of characters of different races, different gender expressions, sexualities. We've got fat and disabled rep as well, and I just thought that this was a fun debut. It didn't take itself too seriously, but when it did, I thought it did those notes well in a way that made a good cohesive whole. So I'm going to be giving this a 4-star. Then I read Sword of Destiny by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is the second book in the Witcher series, and the second one that is a short story collection. So the first 2 books in the series are short story collections. The third book is the first novel. Before I talk about the book itself, I would like to say I did get this illustrated edition. This was a gift from my family. This was original price $40 US. Very, very beautiful dust jacket. There's a quote underneath it, but it kind of looks a little bit cheap. And then when you actually look in the book, I believe that there are only 7 or maybe 8 illustrations, and if you look on this end paper, all of them are spoiled before you even get to the stories. Like, some of them are printed up front again too. And honestly, I feel like this was lazy and kind of cutting a little bit of corners. I would have liked to see more art introduced on the page for a book that is over twice the price of another edition I could have gotten. This series is about Geralt of Rivia, who lives in this fantasy world. He is a witcher, which is a person who is tortured and like genetically changed to be a monster hunter. He's one of the last witchers, and he has a very specific code that he goes to, and he's constantly running into trouble as different people are trying to hire him for different jobs. And we have 6 different short stories in here of him doing different jobs, running into different things. I did not like this collection as much as I liked the first one. I think I give the first one 4 stars. However, I listened to that book on audio, and that book was actually written after this one. So that could be a couple more reasons why I could like that. I also thought the first short story collection felt more cohesive than this one. I didn't love the treatment of women in this book. There's one story of the 6 that both involves women and does not talk about them in a gross way. The other 5 either did not involve women at all or talked about them in a weird, gross way that makes me think that this author doesn't have the greatest opinion of women or doesn't see them in 3 dimensions. The first book I enjoyed so much because the stories felt like fairy tales and they have their little message at the end. And some of these, I saw the message and didn't get behind them. Particularly, what was the story? A Little Sacrifice I thought was particularly bad. That also began with 2 sentences about a mermaid's boobs. Not describing the mermaid, just her boobs. I thought Eternal Flame was actually good, and The Sword of Destiny was pretty good, but the other 3, like, I could leave them. Like, I didn't really care. If this was my first introduction to The Witcher, I do not think I would have been continuing in it, but I liked the first book enough that I am willing to try the third book. So I'm going to be giving that one 3 stars. Then I listened to Breeding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is about our author, who is an indigenous woman who is also a botanist and has been a professor of botany as well. It is talking about how indigenous cultures had a sustaining relationship with nature that was mutually beneficial to both nature and humans. Meanwhile, Western culture, which has so many different emphases, I don't know, had different values than indigenous cultures, has always had such a negative relationship with nature and has only taken and taken, and how Western culture has made you believe in science in only one way. There's only certain questions that are very valuable to ask. Everything is about getting more out of something rather than giving back. Lots and lots of other themes there. It's a little bit memoir, a little bit culture, a little bit justice, a little bit science. Like, this book has a little bit of everything as it kind of meanders from anecdote to anecdote about different plants and how indigenous cultures have had a relationship with them. And I thought that the author does a very good job showing how humanity is not doomed to just run the earth into the ground, because for hundreds and thousands of years, people did live in harmony with nature. And if you sort of change your mindset to be, as the author described it, immigrants becoming natives of the land, we can get to a point where we have a more positive relationship with the earth. If you are interested in like climate science, if you're interested in nature and anti-colonialism in general, I think this is something you could really get something out of. I did listen to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author, which I thought was well done. Even though this deals with science, the audiobook was not a bad choice. It does not get so into the weeds that you can't remember things. It is told in pretty plain language and everything, so the audiobook is not the bad way to go. So again, this is a nonfiction. I didn't feel strongly about giving this a star rating, so I'm not going to. Then I read Chain Gang All-Stars by Nanakwam Adjei-Brenyah. This is a literary dystopian novel that is inspired by incarceration in the US. Years in the future, a act has been signed into law so that people who have long enough prison sentences can enroll in this program to essentially become gladiators and fight in death matches. Every single match is a death match. This program has become the most widely watched sport. There are like different reality shows that are built around it, and these people are constantly under surveillance, and violence is so rewarded of them because people have ostracized them and believe that they deserve so much torture because of the crimes they have committed. This is an ensemble piece, so we follow a lot of different perspectives to give a more fleshed out version of this world. So we have people who are fighting in the CAPE program, some people who are prisoners who are deciding to become part of it. There are people who are enjoying watching the sport, people who are involved in making it happen, and people who are trying to stop it from happening, or rather, stop it from continuing. This is just such an accomplishment. This is one of the most interesting and thought-provoking books I've read all year. This really reminded me of Babel by R.F. Kuang in the way that it is taking an element of systemic racism in the real world and bringing it into a speculative sphere and treating it sort of as a historical document. There are footnotes in this book, sometimes describing speculative things and also things that have happened in the real world, like real life statistics. I watched an interview with the author, and this book came about because his father was a defense lawyer and defended murderers, and the author kind of had to think about like, oh, is my dad evil? Is my dad the bad guy? This book humanizes so many people. Like, it does not forgive them for the violence that they did before they were imprisoned. And I think that this is such a fantastic critique of the US prison system and our incarceration rates, how they are so unbalanced towards Black people, how the US has the largest incarcerated population on Earth, and how easily people can change what they think is right when they other a person, when they see someone as not human. Even though we get a lot of perspectives, this is definitely a snapshot in time. We don't see a lot of change in this world. I'm debating whether I wish this book was longer and showed more of this world, or if I think it was the right choice to stick with this amount. That's kind of where I'm on the fence between like a 4.75 and a 5. But I just think that this did such a fantastic job of doing everything that it wanted to do. It really made me think. I actually had a nightmare reading this book, and it's just going to be on my mind for a long time. Read this book. And I only had one day left in the month to get another book off my TBR, so I picked the shortest book that I have, and that is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This is a very short modern classic that is about a boy who's a shepherd, and he has a dream that he needs to go find treasure at the Great Pyramids in Egypt, and he sort of shifts his whole life around following omens to try to get to his destiny, to fulfill his personal legend. Personally, legendly, I feel like this book is for people who read maybe one book a year, and that book is a self help or a motivational book. That is not me. I don't think that this book really did anything interesting. It is very much one of those follow your dreams books. It's not written in an interesting way. I don't think it gives any insights that you can't find in other places. Was it worth it for me to read this book, even though it only took me, a day to do it? Like, I felt like this book was pranking me into thinking it was deeper than it was. It's like an old man tells him that the universe will let you do your dream if you just want it hard enough and you work hard enough, which, personally, that's a little bit of a privileged thing to say. That if you just want something hard enough and you have people who support you, you'll get there. So basic, says nothing. This also was written in the 80s, so it's definitely got some outdated language in it. There is outdated language for just about every race, and also light sexism. It's not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, but the fact that our main character falls in love at first sight with this woman of the desert, and the only trait that we know about women of the desert is that they know that their men will wander and will just wait for them to come home, is gross. Like, okay, so the whole book is about people fulfilling their personal legends, but these women of the desert aren't allowed to have personal legends? No, not interested. I don't think this was worth a day of my reading, and if you really need somebody to tell you to go chase your dreams, I guess you can pick this up, or I could just tell you and you don't have to waste several hours. Follow your dreams. So yeah, I think I'm giving this a 2.5. Maybe I should give it even lower because I think it's dumb. But for the second time that I have filmed this, those were all of the books that I read in November. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you read in November. I'd love to talk to you about them. If you read any of these, let's chat down below. If you'd like to find me or my readathon or my book club anywhere, you can find us at the links in the description. And if you'd like to watch more of my videos, including freezeathon stuff I have coming out, you can hit that subscribe button. And as always, I will see you in the next one.